He used to believe he was meant for something greater. Not just another name in the crowd, not another voice lost in the noise. Every night he stared at the ceiling, imagining the version of himself the world would remember, the version that mattered, the version that wasn't ordinary. And yet every morning he woke up the same room, same phone, same silence. He scrolled past the faces of people who had made it, the perfect lives, the polished smiles, the effortless success, and somewhere inside, a quiet whisper began to grow. Why not me? That question became his heartbeat. Every achievement felt like survival, not joy. Every quiet moment felt like failure. Because in a world that worships attention, being unseen feels like death. He didn't realize when it started. Maybe the first time someone said you're special. Maybe when he believed them. We tell children they're unique, but what we really mean is be more than others. And so they grow up chasing difference like oxygen, terrified of being average. But average is what most of life is made of. The quiet mornings, the unremarkable days, the invisible kindness. And yet he couldn't bear it. The thought of blending in, the thought of being no one. He wanted to shine but never stopped to ask, shine for whom? One night he walked through the city, empty streets, lights flickering on wet asphalt, the kind of silence that makes your thoughts louder. He passed a group of people laughing, and for a second he felt like an outsider in his own world, like everyone else was already living the life he was still rehearsing. He pulled out his phone, opened the app he hated most, and started scrolling again. Perfect lives, perfect captions, perfect lies. He didn't realize it, but he wasn't comparing achievements anymore. He was comparing identities. He had become addicted to the illusion of uniqueness. There's a cruel truth buried inside that addiction. When you build your worth on being different, you become terrified of ever being the same, and in that fear you lose the freedom to simply exist. You start performing instead of living, curating instead of feeling, hoping someone will notice you so you can finally notice yourself. But the applause never comes, not because the world is cruel, but because no amount of noise can fill a silent soul. He stopped walking. The wind was cold. The street was quiet, and for the first time, he didn't check his phone. He just stood there. The lights reflected on the puddles at his feet. Everything looked real again, and he realized something he never had before. Maybe the opposite of being ordinary isn't being special, but being present. That night, he went home with no answers, but with a strange calm he couldn't explain. He didn't feel successful, but he didn't feel lost either. For the first time, being no one didn't feel like a failure. It felt like peace, because sometimes the only way to find yourself is to stop trying to be someone else. We were raised to believe we're different, that each of us carries a spark, a destiny waiting to unfold, a greatness just waiting to be discovered. It sounds beautiful, but it's also a trap, because when everyone is told they're special, then being normal feels like failure, and so begins the quiet competition, a race to prove that our existence means more than someone else's. We try to stand out in our work, in our looks, in our thoughts, but the harder we try to be seen, the more invisible we become. We've mistaken visibility for value. We no longer live to experience life. We live to be witnessed. The philosopher Erich Fromm once said, "Modern man lives under the illusion that he knows what he wants, while he actually wants what he is told to want, and that's the tragedy." We don't chase meaning, we chase validation. We don't search for truth, we search for applause. Our lives have become performances, each moment rehearsed for an invisible audience. We take photos of sunsets we never actually watch. We post quotes we don't live by. We smile for people who aren't even looking. The fear of being ordinary has made us actors in our own lives. But here's the secret no one tells you. The need to be special comes from the fear of being unloved. When love becomes conditional based on success, looks, or recognition, we learn that only the extraordinary deserve affection. So we start chasing achievements, believing that the more impressive we are, the more worthy we become. But love that has to be earned is not love, it's approval. And approval is never enough. That's why no accomplishment ever feels like enough. Why every victory fades faster than the one before, because you can't fill a spiritual void with social validation. You can build a career, collect followers, win awards, and still feel unseen. Because the truth is, you never wanted fame. You wanted to be known, not by millions, but by someone. Someone who could look at you and say, "I see you," not for what you've done, but for who you are. But the world doesn't reward authenticity. It rewards performance. It sells perfection, filters flaws, and glorifies the image over the essence. We've built a culture where even sincerity has to look good, and when honesty doesn't trend, people start editing their souls. The irony is, our obsession with uniqueness has made us all the same. We speak the same motivational words, we follow the same trends, we fight the same invisible war for attention. We've turned individuality into a product, and in doing so we've lost what made us human in the first place, the beauty of simply being. And maybe that's the quiet lesson the man on the rainy street was starting to learn, that his worth wasn't hidden in some future version of himself, but in the ordinary moments he kept running from, that maybe the fear of being ordinary was the very thing keeping him from living freely. At some point the applause stops, the lights go out, and all the roles you played start to blur together. You wake up and realize you've spent years trying to impress an audience that never existed. Because the truth is, no one's really watching. Not the way you think they are. Most people are too busy performing their own parts to notice yours. And that realization, it hurts at first. It feels like losing something. But maybe it's freedom in disguise. We were never built to live on stage. We were built to live within ourselves. The constant need to be seen has blinded us to the miracle of simply being. You don't need to shine to exist. You just need to feel. To breathe, to notice. We forget that stars don't try to sparkle, they just burn. Somewhere in the quiet, you start to remember what it feels like to do something without showing anyone, to write something no one will read, to walk without posting it, to cry without explaining it, to feel alive without witnesses. That's when you begin to understand what authenticity really is, not a brand, not an identity, but a return to the parts of you that don't need validation to exist. When you stop chasing the spotlight, you begin to see the beauty in the shadows, the small invisible moments that make life real, the way light hits a window, the sound of rain at 3 a.m., the quiet presence of someone who doesn't demand anything from you. That's what being human is supposed to feel like, not constant relevance, but quiet resonance. And maybe that's what the man in the city started to feel, as he stood under the dim light, his reflection fading in the puddle below him. He wasn't a success. He wasn't a failure. He was just there, existing, breathing, unremarkable, and finally okay with it. Because there's peace in not being extraordinary. There's power in being ordinary. Fully, consciously, beautifully ordinary. The world taught him to be visible, but life was teaching him to be real. He used to think being special was freedom. That uniqueness meant escape from mediocrity, from boredom, from the weight of being just another face in the crowd. But now he saw the paradox. The more he tried to be different, the more he became the same. Because the fear of being ordinary doesn't make you original, it makes you predictable. Everyone trying to stand out ends up standing in the same line. Different colors, same desire. Different dreams, same emptiness. Society told us to be authentic. But only if that authenticity sells. We turn self-expression into a marketplace. We brand our personalities, we monetize our pain, we curate our vulnerability, until even honesty becomes a form of performance. We have mistaken exposure for existence. The philosopher Kierkegaard once wrote, "The crowd is untruth." He wasn't warning us about other people, he was warning us about ourselves. Because the moment you define yourself by comparison, you've already lost your truth. You stop asking, "Who am I?" and start asking, "Who am I compared to them?" And that question never ends. It devours you. It steals every quiet moment that could have been peace. He remembered how every time he achieved something, the happiness faded too fast, like trying to hold water with open hands. Because when the reason you strive is fear, no amount of success will ever set you free. He realized he wasn't chasing dreams, he was running from insignificance. The world had convinced him that ordinary meant invisible, but invisibility isn't the absence of worth, it's the beginning of self. When no one's looking, you can finally stop performing. When no one's judging, you can finally start being. That's the paradox. You find your truest self only when you stop trying to prove you have one. The quiet ones, the listeners, the builders, the lovers who give without needing credit. Maybe they were the ones who truly understood life. Maybe greatness was never about being noticed, but about noticing. To notice the small beauty in ordinary things, the way sunlight hits a dusty window, the sound of laughter that isn't recorded, the simple kindness that doesn't need to be seen to matter. That's where meaning hides, not in the extraordinary, but in the everyday. And maybe that's what being human really is, not a performance, not a legacy, but a moment fully lived, quietly felt, gone before it can be captured. He stopped running. For years he'd been chasing something he couldn't even name, a version of himself built from fragments of everyone else. He thought freedom meant standing out, but it was exhausting, because to always be someone you have to keep pretending you know who that is. And that's not freedom, that's fear wearing a mask of confidence. So he let it go, the need to be admired, the hunger to be seen, the obsession with becoming extraordinary. And in that silence, something strange happened. He didn't feel empty. He felt light. It's a quiet kind of liberation when you realize you don't have to perform anymore, you can just exist. Not as a brand, not as an idea, just as a person. There's a line between striving and suffocating, between growing and constantly proving. He had lived his whole life on the wrong side of that line. But now there was peace in stillness, there was joy in smallness. When you stop trying to be someone, you make space to become yourself. It's not about giving up, it's about giving in to the flow of life, the unpredictability, the ordinariness. Ordinary isn't the opposite of greatness, it's the soil that greatness grows from, because every extraordinary thing begins in a quiet, ordinary moment. A thought before it's written, a breath before it's spoken, a step before it's seen. He realized that maybe meaning wasn't something you chase, maybe it's something you allow. When you stop fighting to be special, you start seeing how rare simplicity is, how rare it is to truly listen, to sit with yourself without distraction, to not need to be more than you already are. That's the freedom no one talks about, the freedom of being no one, and feeling whole anyway. The irony is when you stop trying to stand out, you finally do. Not because you're louder, but because you're real, and real things don't need attention to matter. The world has enough voices. What it lacks is presence, and presence is the quiet glow of a person who's no longer pretending. He walked through the same city streets, but this time it felt different. The noise was still there, but it didn't reach him anymore. The lights, the people, the endless movement, they no longer made him feel small. Because he finally understood, he wasn't part of a crowd trying to be seen. He was part of life, and that was enough. For the first time in his life, he stopped measuring. No longer counting how far he had come, how much he had achieved, how close he was to enough. He realized there is a quiet dignity in existing without needing to justify it. He looked around, the flicker of a street light, the sound of leaves brushing against the wind, the distant hum of life continuing somewhere beyond his reach, and it all felt holy. Not because it was grand, but because it was real. Maybe that's what we've all forgotten. That life isn't supposed to be a masterpiece, it's supposed to be lived. We chase beauty and perfection, but beauty was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be noticed. A chipped mug, a wrinkled face, a trembling hand holding another. These are not flaws, they're proofs of existence. Perfection is sterile, ordinariness is alive. He began to see meaning in everything he once ignored. The stranger who held the elevator, the warmth of morning light through dirty glass, the silence after laughter. All of it, tiny, quiet, sacred. It was as if every moment whispered, "You were never supposed to be special. You were supposed to be aware." Philosophy calls it mindfulness. Religion calls it grace. Poets call it love. But maybe it's all the same thing. The awareness that being alive is already extraordinary. We've spent centuries trying to transcend our humanity, to become gods through technology, fame, and control. But what if divinity was never above us? It was within us all along. Every breath, every heartbeat, every second that passes unnoticed. Each one, a small prayer of being. He smiled, not because he understood everything, but because he didn't need to anymore. Meaning wasn't something to be solved, it was something to be felt. The world didn't change that night. The city still buzzed, the screen still glowed. But something inside him shifted quietly, a realization that everything he had been searching for was already here, waiting for him to slow down long enough to see it. And maybe that's what peace really is, not the absence of chaos, but the acceptance of it. The understanding that even the noise, even the imperfection belongs, because once you stop fighting to be extraordinary, you start realizing that everything already is. He walked back into the same streets that once felt like a maze. The same lights, the same faces, the same endless rhythm of existence. But something had changed. Not the city, him. He no longer felt the need to escape. He no longer needed to prove. For the first time, the noise didn't drown him, it carried him. He was no longer the man chasing meaning. He was the man living it. The coffee shop he used to rush past now smelled like warmth. The rain he once hated now sounded like music. Even silence had texture. It wasn't empty anymore. He realized that life doesn't suddenly become beautiful. It always was. He had just been too busy measuring it to see it. Most people spend their lives waiting for the moment when everything finally makes sense, when the chaos clears, when the story resolves, when the real life begins. But there is no real life waiting on the other side. This is it. The confusion, the smallness, the imperfection. That's where meaning hides. He finally understood. Peace isn't found by escaping reality, but by returning to it without fear. There's something sacred in accepting the ordinary. Because once you stop trying to make life extraordinary, it starts to feel miraculous on its own. Every moment becomes a miracle. Every breath an act of courage. Every person you meet, a reflection of something divine. You stop waiting for the world to impress you, and start being impressed that you're even here. Breathing, seeing, feeling, for this brief, impossible moment. And maybe that's what growing up really means. Not achieving more, but needing less. Not reaching for meaning, but realizing you're standing in it. The city was the same, but he wasn't watching it anymore. He was part of it. Every light, every sound, every heartbeat connected, alive, enough. And in that simple truth, he found everything he had been searching for. Maybe the greatest tragedy of life is that we spend so much of it trying to matter when in reality we already do. We try to leave marks, build legacies, change the world, but the world was never asking us to change it. It was asking us to feel it, to be here, to notice. Every breath you take is proof that you've already made it to this exact moment, to this quiet intersection of time and consciousness. That's not small, that's sacred. He finally understood. Life doesn't need to be extraordinary to be meaningful. You don't have to be special, you just have to be alive. Because being alive in a world this fragile and temporary is already a miracle. And if this story made you pause even for a second, then that pause is everything. Because reflection is resistance, stillness is rebellion, and awareness is freedom. That's what we try to explore here, on Lumora Mind. Stories not about heroes, but about humans. Not about perfection, but about perception. And if you found something in these words, something that whispered to you even faintly, remember, it wasn't me who said it. It was you, recognizing something you already knew. This was Lumora Mind, where thought meets silence, and silence becomes understanding. If this voice stayed with you, subscribe, not for me, but for the part of you that's still searching, still asking, still alive.